Okay, hello, this is video lecture number 55. Today we are looking at Harvest of Blood, Native Peoples Dispossessed. Our subsections today are the Civil War and Indians on the Plains, Grant's peace policy, the end of armed resistance, and strategies of survival. So the settlement of the American West came at the expense of the original inhabitants who were forced off their lands and onto reservations. To be sure, native peoples put up an armed and heroic resistance. One of the most famous of these instances was the Battle of the Little Bighorn River on June 25th, 1876, otherwise known as Custer's Last Stand. However, by 1890, these patriots were vanquished by the vastly superior military force that the U.S. government sent against them. The Helena Daily Herald, for example, reports the sensational story of George Custer's controversial attack on a large Indian encampment in Montana Territory and the annihilation of the men in his detachment. He is largely criticized, and the failure of the U.S. government is criticized in its ability to keep its promise to these Native Americans. In 1887, Congress tried to deal with the plight of Native Americans through something called the Dawes Severalty Act. We also have some documents of Buffalo Bird Woman who looks back on a way of life prior to her removal from the reservation. And again, like before, if you're interested in reading that, I have it available for you. So let's go ahead and get started. A Harvest of Blood with the first subsection, the Civil War and Indians on the Plains. So before the Civil War, Congress gave the Great Plains to Native Americans because they thought it could not be farmed. But railroads, steel, plows, and the desire for land reversed that decision. The Sioux and other tribes fought against federal government attempts to place them on reservations. In 1862, in Minnesota, the Sioux responded by massacring white settlers. President Lincoln hanged the leaders and exiled the remainder from the state. The Dakota Sioux Uprising escalated tensions elsewhere between whites and Indians. In 1864, Colonel Chivington led his troops to commit the Sand Creek Massacre of Cheyenne in eastern Colorado. The Sioux and Arapaho responded with more attacks. In December of 1866, the Sioux wiped out 80 men under Captain Fetterman and successfully closed the Bozeman Trail. By 1869, public opinion had turned against warfare as an effective means to subdue Indian tribes. Congressional leaders searched for other options to deal with this, quote, Indian problem. So let's look at that. Let's look at Grant's peace policy. Christian reformers heavily influenced the Grant administration's peace policy. Reformers argued that Indians could be transformed into whites through education and religious indoctrination, particularly of Indian youth in special boarding schools. The first boarding school opened at Carlisle in 1879. Corruption, racism, and denominational infighting reduced the effectiveness of the boarding school campaign. To Indian leaders, reformers became just another interest group. Now, Indian tribes were forced by political circumstances to eventually accommodate. In 1871, Congress abolished further treaty making with Indian tribes. The Supreme Court further ended tribal power in Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock of 1903, stating that Congress could make any policies it chose and could ignore existing treaties. In Ex parte Crow Dog, the court ruled that Indians were not citizens unless approved by Congress. Indians would remain the wards of the government until the 1930s. Another assimilation measure attempted to free Indians from their tribal past, this time through land taking. The Dawes Severalty Act of 1887 held that all Indians would receive allotments of reservation land, and the remainder would be sold to non-Indians. The Bureau of Indian Affairs' carelessness, corruption, and greed doomed this act. 15 million surplus acres alone were taken from tribes in Indian Territory by 1894, facilitating the birth of the state of Oklahoma. Before Dawes, Indians had held over 155 million acres of land. By 1900, this had dropped to 77 million. By 1934, Native peoples had lost 66% of the land that had been allotted to them. So let's look at the end of this armed resistance, our next subsection. By 1873, only Sitting Bull, the great Lakota Sioux leader, openly refused to go to a reservation. A crisis came on the Northern Plains in 1876 when the Sioux refused to sell the Black Hills as demanded by the federal government. On June 25, 1876, George A. Custer pursued a reckless strategy and suffered annihilation by Chief Crazy Horse's Sioux and Cheyenne warriors at the Little Bighorn. This was the last victory of the Plains Indians against the U.S. Army. The Apache hated their reservation, so they made life miserable for white settlers in the Southwest until their chief, Geronimo, was finally captured in 1886. The United States had completed, then, its military conquest of the West. So let's look at the next section, strategies of survival. Despite living on reservations and halting armed resistance, most Native people continued to practice traditional languages, traditional ceremonies, and arts. Most Native peoples also selectively adopted white ways, such as the use of the English language and skills such as agriculture. Most Native people blended old and new ways. One of the most famous Native people who assimilated during this era was Dr. Charles Eastman, a Dakota Sioux boy trained in white schools to become a medical doctor. The ghost dance movement symbolized the syncretism or blending together of white and Indian ways. The dance drew on Christian and Native elements, spreading from reservation to reservation across the West and ultimately uniting Indian communities. Now, the ghost dance alarmed many local whites. On December 29, 1890, at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota, U.S. Army soldiers massacred 150 Lakota Sioux people. The soldiers feared that the ghost dance would provoke war. By 1890, the United States included 40 states, an industrial economy that rivaled Britain and Germany, steady immigration, and inklings of becoming a major player in foreign places. A new American empire was also forming abroad. Okay, so this does conclude today's video lecture. At this time, please answer your review questions and continue with your notes.